Time now for your waiver wire, presented by Snickers. Rookie mistake, maybe you just need a Snickers. I'm Jamie Eisenberg, that's Dave Richard. We're taking a look at your waiver wire options here for week number 5, and lots of things going on with some teams on a bye, and you have some tough roster decisions to make. Dave, let's start with the quarterbacks here. And a couple of big-name guys that are missing, but we also have some guys that are dealing with some injuries as well. Unfortunately, you might not have some of these quarterbacks available to you. Sean Watson and Justin Herbert are on bye. Jimmy Garoppolo is expected to return, coming back from the concussion, something to keep an eye on there. Matthew Stafford should be good to go. Kenny Pickett, we thought might be out for an extended period of time, but it sounds like he might be able to play in week 5 against the Ravens. And Kyler Murray, we know, still on the PUP list, does not expect to come back anytime soon. The quarterbacks that you're looking to pick up as replacement options, mostly for Justin Herbert and Deshaun Watson because of their bye week situation, not necessarily their injuries. Sam Howell looks like the best one, taking on the Bears. Joshua Dobbs actually playing very well of late. Interesting matchup against the Bengals. Zach Wilson in the Nathaniel Hackett revenge game. Mitch Trubisky, Taylor Heineke, Bailey Zappi, all 2 QB options. Trubisky would be a potential starter in 2 QB leagues just because he might start for the Steelers. And then we got, again, the quarterbacks on a bye: Herbert, Watson, Geno Smith, and Baker Mayfield. So fantasy managers in 2 quarterback leagues could be scrambling a little bit. And let's start with Sam Howell, Dave, who I got to tell you, I was impressed. You know, miserable against the Bills in week 3, bounced back in a big way against the Eagles in the overtime loss. The rushing yards were there. That's what was nice to see, because we had been expecting that a little bit more. He did 10 rushing yards, 11 yards in the first 2 weeks, but he barely scored a fantasy point in week 3. 4 interceptions, 9 sacks. So coming off the game against the Eagles, really the best thing about it, though, is the matchup against the Bears. Is he a #1 quarterback for you, or just more of an option in Superflex and 2 QB?
He's just outside my top 12. I definitely like him, certainly love him as a bye week replacement. And what's been my beef about Sam Howell for the last 2 months? It's that when he's under pressure, he isn't very good. He kind of put those concerns to rest against Philadelphia, and now he's taking on Chicago. The Bears defense really still struggled. You saw Russell Wilson have a big game against them. I think he could notch his 3rd straight week with at least 20 fantasy points out of 4, and that's a good thing for Sam Howell, an absolute great quarterback to get off the waiver wire.
#1 in terms of most fantasy points allowed to the position are the Bears, and as we saw, Russell Wilson had a big game in the comeback win against Chicago in Chicago last week. So short week for the Commanders and the Bears, and Sam Howell playing well. 2 other guys that are playing well are Josh Dobbs and Zach Wilson, things I never thought I'd be saying heading into week 5 of the NFL season, but here we are. And we'll start with Dobbs, who looked good last week, you know, and has really been good the last 3 games, averaging over 24 fantasy points per game in that stretch. The rushing yards have been there for him. He's top 5 in terms of rush yards for the position. And then Zach Wilson, arguably his best game as a pro. He's had some other games with better fantasy production, but he looked good against the Chiefs. Should have had a touchdown to Tyler Conklin. Got that. He might have had his best game as a fantasy quarterback, but big matchup as well, taking on the Broncos. So of these 2 guys, do you have faith in either one, and would you start either of them over Sam Howell?
Would you believe I have faith in Josh Dobbs? I have faith in Zach Wilson too, but it's a little bit more because of the matchup than anything else. But Dobbs has been a fantasy manager's dream come true. What do we want from our quarterbacks in fantasy? We want a guy who can throw well and run, and Dobbs has been able to do that. Good matchup against the Cincinnati defense that hasn't played to expectations, and they might be without one of their starting cornerbacks this week, and we're seeing that receiving core come alive for Arizona as well. I like Dobbs better than Wilson. It's really just a great matchup for Wilson. He won't be under much pressure against the Broncos. We've seen a lot of quarterbacks this year, including Sam Howell and recently Justin Fields, put up their best numbers of the season against this Broncos defense. I think Wilson could be the next up in line. I would rank the 3: Howell, Dobbs, Zach Wilson.
Yep, I would agree with that ranking as well. And some quarterbacks you might be moving on from. Again, bye weeks are going to matter here. You might have some roster considerations to make, but Matthew Stafford is pretty amazing. He's now gone 17 games going back to the 2021 campaign, only 2 of them over 20 fantasy points. So as the receiving core is getting healthy, hopefully Cooper Kupp is back. Just can't trust Stafford right now, who's gotten great production out of, as we know, Puka Nacua, Taylor Higbee the last 2 weeks, Tutu Atwell for the first 3 games of the season. So I don't know if you want to trust Matthew Stafford. Kenny Pickett, we know, might miss some time. I'm still curious why he's rostered in 52% of leagues. It's got to be 2 QB in Superflex leagues because he's not got the job done. It is the hair. Could be the gloves as well. And then Derek Carr played through the shoulder injury last week, a little bit surprising, and did not play very well. He has 1 game over 10 fantasy points so far this season. So again, in 1 quarterback leagues, easy to move on from him. Let's look now at the running backs. And again, some of these guys are on a bye, specifically Austin Eckler, but you got Barkley hopefully back in week 5 after the miserable Giants performance on Monday night. Jonathan Taylor trending in the right direction. Seems like he's going to play in week 5. We'll find out when. Wednesday, if in fact he does practice. Javonte Williams, the big injury to monitor for this week. And then these other guys behind Javonte Williams, not a lot of starting options there. But Keontae Ingram, something to keep an eye on. Rico Dowdle as well, because they are handcuffs for guys that are getting a lot of work. So just keep an eye on those situations in Dallas and Arizona, respectively. The running backs to add for this week, which we'll get into in a second. But Jaleel McLaughlin looks like the prize of the free agent class for week 5 at any position. Chuba Hubbard playing behind and banged up Miles Sanders right now. A couple guys in Baltimore that might have some prominence for a running back group that is very, very crowded. And then again, some of these handcuffs that you're looking at, Ronnie Rivers, Deuce Vaughn, Latavius Murray, those will be the next in line should an injury occur to those respective backfields. The running backs on a bye, no Chargers, no Browns, no Bucks, and no Seahawks. Again, you're going to miss Austin Eckler, although you've missed him for the last 3 weeks. You'll miss Kenneth Walker. Those have been the 2 best of this group. Jerome Ford, again, hold on to him through his bye. You could probably move on from Kareem Hunt at this point. 2 subpar performances since coming back to Cleveland. All right, let's get into the guys that we're looking to add here, Dave. And again, Jaleel McLaughlin looks like the best of the bunch. Javonte Williams banged up. Sean Payton singing the praises of the rookie running back. He only had 10 total touches, but was significantly better than Samaje Perine, and really significantly better than anything Javonte Williams has done so far this year. So twofold. One, if Javonte Williams is out, how much do you like McLaughlin? And then if Javonte Williams surprises us and plays, or when he does eventually return from this hip injury, who's the best running back in Denver?
I would like McLaughlin as a number 2 fantasy running back if there is no Javonte Williams. And Javonte really has only impressed in one way this season. He's been physical when he's had the ball. He finishes his run strong, but he's not fast at all. And that's exactly what McLaughlin is. He's got great smooth cuts. He can catch the ball out of the backfield, and he's easily the fastest running back in Denver, ahead of both Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine. So I'm excited about him, but I've got to think a little bit more long-term with Jaleel McLaughlin. This is not the same thing as Jerome Ford 2 weeks ago or Devon Achane last week, but it's somebody that we talked about on this set, saying that he could end up being somebody that helps you out in fantasy, who you don't have to go and spend up a lot for. Unfortunately, not a lot of people listen to that. Now he's going to be the number 1 waiver claim. People are going to spend a lot of fab on him. I think he's okay as a number 2 running back if there's no Javonte Williams. And then he might end up usurping Javonte Williams as the season rolls on. But I wouldn't count on that happening once Javonte comes back. It might take a couple games after.
And just be cautious with the amount of fab you're going to spend, because it is a situation where Javonte has not been ruled out even for week 5 yet. So you don't want to just overspend for a player that may end up not giving you the type of fantasy production that you're hoping for. Let's go down to the wide receivers and the injuries that we're looking at here. I'm sorry, running backs to drop first. A.J. Dillon, very uninspiring with his performances without Aaron Jones.
Is that right? 4.3 PPR points per game?
Ugly. It's very, very ugly. Kareem Hunt, 2 miserable performances since coming back to Cleveland. Again, the matchups were a little bit ugly, but still Jerome Ford getting the majority of production there. Joshua Kelly, disappointing in 3 games without Austin Eckler on a bye. You can move on from him. And then good luck for anybody that's still holding on to Ezekiel Elliott. All right, now let's get to the wide receivers and the injury looking at here. And we got some good news on Mike Evans. The Bucs are on a bye. He should be able to return in week 6 with a hamstring injury. T. Higgins says he's going to try and play through the rib injury, something to keep an eye on there. Cooper Kupp is eligible to return in week 5. Hopefully get him back. Deontay Johnson we won't see until week 7, so just keep an eye on that. A good buy low candidate if somebody's willing to move on from him, because despite the quarterback woes, Deontay Johnson will definitely produce, because he has with a lot of different quarterbacks throughout his career. All right, the players to add at the position. This is a very interesting list, Dave, because there's not a standout guy amongst the group now. There may be some guys that stand out eventually, specifically Michael Wilson and Jameson Williams. There's a lot of upside with guys like Wan'Dale Robinson and Marvin Mims and Rashee Rice, those type of players in particular. And then Tyler Boyd just gets a potential to see even more targets. Got 24 targets in his last 3 games. If there is no T. Higgins in PPR, that could matter, because we know Joe Burrow dumping the ball off, so just something to keep an eye on there with the Higgins injury. The wide receivers that are on a bye for this week, a big list of names with a lot of prominent stars. The big ones, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin now. Got to keep an eye on that, because Godwin was great with Evans dealing with that hamstring injury. So we'll see what happens. Again, Evans, though, is expected to play in week 6. And then DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett also on a bye. Fantasy managers have some tough decisions. We'll show you about some wide receivers to drop, specifically the 2 rookies on this list in Quentin Johnston and Jaxon Smith-Njigba. All right, let's talk about some of these guys here, Dave. Michael Wilson, great last week. Had an 86-yard day in week 3, but only 2 catches. Is there enough targets and production from Joshua Dobbs, who's been playing great, for Michael Wilson to eventually crack the top 36 and be a number 3 wide receiver on a consistent basis?
I'm going to say yes. I'm really impressed with this guy. He's big, he's strong, he's got unbelievable agility, he's got great route versatility for a rookie. He fights for contested catches, and he's fast on top of it all. So I think that he's going to have an opportunity to still be basically the #2 wide receiver in this Arizona offense. I think he could eventually end up hurting Zach Ertz, who's been a target hog for the first 4 weeks of the season, and Marquise Brown, obviously the #1 guy there. But I've been impressed by Dobbs. We talked about him as somebody to pick up. This guy is somebody who I think fantasy managers should put on benches, potentially start in PPR leagues right away, because he's got a lot of talent. The one thing you do have to worry about, and this was a problem with him in college, was that he got hurt a lot. And so there could be an injury issue that comes up down the line. But for now, he's healthy, he's playing. 7 targets, 7 catches. Sign me up for that from Michael Wilson.
Just again, don't overpay. It was a great performance against the 49ers. A lot of it was clearly in a comeback effort. But he is somebody that can maybe build towards something toward the second half of the season.
When you say overpay, you're talking fab?
Fab, yeah.
10 to 15%,
At
right?
most, yeah. Don't go crazy, because again, we could just be a flash in the pan for a couple of weeks and then maybe pick him up again down the road if he does struggle. Jameson Williams, we hope, is also somebody who could build toward a big second half of the season. We know that the product out of Alabama, who's gotten unbelievable upside, but has had a lot of problems, whether it's injury or the gambling situation. But the benefit is that his suspension was reduced from 6 games to 4. He's going to play in week 5. Dan Campbell says it's going to be a minimal role to start, but there's a lot to like about what the upside could be with Jared Goff, with Ben Johnson. So Jameson Williams for week 5, and then moving forward, what's your outlook? Stash him. Go ahead and get him. If you don't need a wide receiver and you get the heebie-jeebies about the Arizona Cardinals wide receiving core, I get it. You can pivot to Jameson Williams, and you just wait and see what happens, because you want to talk about talent. Michael Wilson was fairly talented in college. Jameson Williams is just lightning fast and tall to go along with it. Somebody that I think fantasy managers could eventually get something out of. I just wouldn't expect it within the next 2 or 3 games from him. Again, good stash candidate. Same thing with Michael Wilson. And then a guy that might have to help you this week because of an emergency situation could be Tyler Boyd. If Joe Burrow was healthy and T. Higgins was missing time, we'd be calling Tyler Boyd at least a top 30 wide receiver, just based on what he's shown you in the past in his career, and at times when Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have missed time. But now with Burrow banged up a little bit, it's tough to trust Tyler Boyd. But there's a big opportunity here, because he's been 7 targets or more each of the last 3 weeks with Higgins on the field. He might see a bump in targets now. So in PPR, how much do you like Tyler Boyd? I like him. I think that he might be one of those safe floor type of fantasy wide receivers, and I would not prioritize him ahead of the 2 wideouts that we've talked about, or Jaleel McLaughlin either. But I think he's got a floor of 5 catches and 50 yards, and he might even be able to get 7 catches for 70 yards. That's just the type of guy that he is. Short area target, going up against the Cardinals. It's not that hard of a matchup for him. The real concern is whether or not Burrow can find him 10 or more yards downfield. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's been kind of what Tyler Boyd's been anyway. Imagine if Joe Burrow just magically gets healthy and we see some downfield throws. It's going to happen. Throw the ball more than 5 yards down the field. So Tyler Boyd, a good stash candidate. But again, T. Higgins might be able to play in week 5. Wide receivers that you're dropping. So Brandon Cooks, easy move on from him. Same thing with Sky Moore. Same thing with Elijah Moore going into their bye week. But Dave, when you look at Quentin Johnston and Jaxon Smith-Njigba, we love the potential. We love the upside of what they can become. And we already have an injury in Los Angeles for the Chargers with Mike Williams out for the season with the ACL tear. But their production so far has been terrible. So are you holding them or are you dropping them? I would prefer to hold them, but let's say they're the worst players on your bench. I'm going to read off some other names that we didn't talk about that are wide receivers. Compare these names to Johnson and Njigba rest of season. Michael Gallup, Treylon Burks, Marvin Mims, Wan'Dale Robinson. Not inspiring names by any stretch of the imagination, but guys that might be able to help you out in a bye week replacement situation. Maybe there's some upside there with Gallup and Robinson. But those are the types of receivers that you might be able to go back and get if you drop Smith-Njigba or Quentin Johnston, and then need to go and find another wideout because you'll drop those guys and then somebody else picked them up. Yeah, and it's not necessarily a receiver for receiver swap. You know, if you're not starting Wilson, you're not starting Williams, then you hold these guys. But if you have to drop them for McLaughlin, if you have to drop them for a quarterback, then it's just an unfortunate move that you have to make. And I don't know how many people are running in redraft leagues to get those guys. So hopefully you'll be able to get them back if, in fact, you do have to move on. Let's look at the tight ends now and the tight end injuries we're dealing with here. Freiermuth expected to miss 2 to 3 weeks. They have a bye in week 6, so the earliest we'll probably see Pat Freiermuth is week 7, if in fact he's able to return. Tyler Higbee dealing with a thumb injury. We hope he's able to play through that. He's been 11 or more PPR points each of the last 2 weeks, so finally looking like a guy that we thought could be a reliable starter in PPR. Musgrave dealing with a concussion situation, might not have him in week 5. And Juwan Johnson's been one of the bigger disappointments for a guy that we thought could be a low-end starter. But again, the Saints' passing attack really has started to struggle with Derek Carr dealing with the shoulder injury. The tight ends to add this week. This is actually a pretty good list based on what the tight end position has been, knowing that Ferguson has been very productive in 3 of the last 4 games. Cole Kmet coming off a huge game. Zach Ertz has been good in PPR 3 of 4 games, and Logan Thomas and Tyler Conklin are playing in offenses that they're starting to get more production, could be widely available. Jonnu Smith, unfortunately, playing better than Kyle Pitts, not something we thought we would be saying at this point in the season, but he's been 8 or more PPR points each of the last 3 weeks. The tight ends on a bye for week number 5. David Njoku, Gerald Everett, guys you can move on from for this week. Same thing with Parham, same thing with all of these tight ends. Not exactly an inspiring list of the players who are on a bye. Let's talk about Jake Ferguson, because 7 catches, 77 yards on 7 targets. You would have hit you would have won on the slot machine if you got those numbers. Can he be consistent in this offense where Dak Prescott has gotten inconsistent production from CeeDee Lamb? Brandon Cooks has been a disaster so far. Michael Gallup's been consistent the last 2 weeks, but where does Ferguson slot in for the Cowboys and then for fantasy managers?
He's already been consistent the last 3 weeks, at least 9.8 PPR points per game in each of them. It certainly looks like he's taken over for Dalton Schultz as the #1 tight end in the offense, and Dak leans on that position. You can certainly pick him up and start him with confidence.
All right, so we'll hopefully get more production from him, similar production, or if not better, moving forward. 1 touchdown in the first 4 games. Not an easy matchup, as we know, in week 5 against San Francisco. And then Cole Kmet also has a difficult matchup against Commanders. Statistically, they're #1 in fantasy points allowed to tight ends, but he was awesome last week against Denver with the 2 touchdowns. Justin Fields looked better. Kmet looked better. Chase Claypool now out of the way. Can Kmet become a reliable starter?
I've kind of talked myself into Cole Kmet, and a lot of it did have to do with Chase Claypool being out of the picture in Chicago. He's the only big body left in that passing offense for Justin Fields to throw to, and Fields looked great in week 4. He didn't look bad in week 3 either, so he's trending in the right direction. He needs these types of targets, certainly somebody who can move the chains on 3rd downs. So I'm going to take Ferguson first, but I think Kmet, as far as points per game from here on out, maybe like a half step behind Ferguson for the rest of the season.
And then Zach Ertz is coming off another game with 10 targets and 6 catches, his 2nd game of the season with at least 50 yards receiving. He should have caught a touchdown against 49ers. I know anybody that bet the Cardinals were hoping to see him catch that because it would have helped you with the cover there. But in any event, Ertz now 3 games with at least 6 catches. The 1 game he didn't do it was against Dallas. So can he become someone that you could trust in PPR? Obviously not in non-and-half PPR at this point, but in full PPR, those 6 catches matter.
Yeah, and a big non-fist pump for Zach Ertz after what happened in week number 4. I'll say this. I think Michael Wilson is a problem for Zach Ertz, because if he can get going and continue to show that he can be a target for Josh Dobbs, I think that he could end up being the #2 target getter along with Marquise Brown, and that really limits Ertz, who's really a PPR tight end anyway. And the fact that he's dropping touchdowns, not making big plays, really only half of his fantasy points are from his catches. It's hard to really feel good about Zach Ertz. He's 3rd for me on this list.
All right, so hopefully these guys continue to produce. Again, Darren Waller, George Kittle, Dallas Goedert have been huge disappointments. You might consider starting some of these tight ends over those guys, but you're not dropping Waller, Kittle, or Goddard just yet. Here are the tight ends that you might be moving on for from week 5 again. As we told you, dealing with buys or injuries. Freiermuth going to miss a couple of weeks. Njoku and Everett on a bye. Not worth holding those guys while they are not playing. All right, make sure you check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found. We give you the waiver wire options there. We talk in depth about the starts, the sits, the players that matter to you. We go every day of the week, the Fantasy Football Today podcast, wherever podcasts are found.